Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Visibility Factor podcast. This is Sue Barber, your host. Today, I am so excited because I have been waiting for this guest to be able to come on the podcast, and we have finally gotten to the day where she is here. This is Bessi Graham, and I just love her to pieces. I met her in a networking group. I don't know how long ago was that, like 3 years ago, I guess, something like that, and have since been working with her on other things. And I'm so excited for you to meet her, learn from her. So, Bessi, welcome to the show, and I'd love to have you introduce yourself.
Thank you. It's been a while that we've been chatting about doing this, so
I
it's lovely to
know.
finally be with you. So the common theme, Sue, the way I would describe it in terms of giving people a bit of a background around me, is that I have built a number of different businesses, but they've all had one theme, which is trying to help people really awaken the possibility that you can merge money and meaning, and that business isn't just about profit maximization, but that we as humans are multidimensional and therefore our work should be, and we don't need to turn up to work as one part of who we are and sort of disconnect from what brings us purpose or meaning in life. And so that's taken lots of different forms. I started and ran an incubator for startup social enterprises around Australia and the Pacific. I've done a lot of advisory work with government, investment work, setting up investment funds and investing into small and medium-sized businesses. But like I said, if you were to boil it all down, it's about that really beautiful space where we bring together the power of what business can be in the world and the role that we can play as business leaders, and then seeing how does that channel towards things that are actually meaningful to each of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's so many things that I love that you talk about. And when I looked at your biography, I was like, this is crazy. The things that you have done. So you've been involved with United Nations. You're doing stuff with Obama's organization. I mean, there's
Foundation,
just
yeah.
so many things that you are involved in. Can we just go to that for just a second before we get into this other fun stuff? I would love to know how you got involved in all of these different areas and what is it about those that really brings you joy to be a part of them?
Yeah. So again, I would say that the two pieces that are always present, whether you take the work that I've done with the United Nations, the work that I've done with the Obama Foundation, they still come down to those ideas of what's the role of leadership and what's the role of business. That
Mm.
theme is always present. And so in terms of the aspects with the United Nations, it was with the UNDP, so the development program, and that was about trying to change some of the ways that businesses relate with the idea of what's referred to as international development, or in countries where there's this emerging economy, there's different opportunities happening and businesses come in. There tends to be, we see the role of government or big funding groups like the United Nations as they're helping or supporting and putting money in, and businesses are there to make money. You know, there's an extraction and there's different mentalities. The work that I was doing that was bringing together a whole bunch of stuff I had done over, multiple decades, was around saying, how do we get people on the same page, having the same language, saying, we don't need to choose. One of the phrases I always use, Sue, in that work is saying, business isn't a zero-sum game. This isn't about, for a business to win, someone else has to lose.
Mm-hmm.
Often they're the types of unconscious beliefs and ideas that people have. And so we'll think, oh, the people helping and doing the good things run charities or foundations or nonprofits, and business is seen in a different light. The work that I was doing was around coming in and saying, how do we understand the different outcomes that each group is trying to achieve, and where is there that common ground where we can say, oh, there's an overlap here. If businesses actually helped achieve some of the United Nations goals around water and not polluting water and making sure there was drinking water available for everyone, that would also reduce the costs of that business in the production of their, the drinks, for example, in one of the companies that was producing drinks. So where do we find common ground and stop seeing things as, oh, I will sacrifice some of my profit to help you achieve your goals, and instead really use one of the things that you and I have talked about many times, is this idea of the business model canvas. So use the way we think about our business to make different decisions that actually create that win-win. So we're not choosing, I will sacrifice profit to contribute, but we're instead saying, maybe the innovation here is in the process of thinking about this differently, I could actually create something that is good for the business and good for the society that I work in. So that's sort of the angle around something which might seem quite massive or overwhelming, of like, oh, what are the United Nations doing and how does that fit with the work? And to something like the amazing work the Obama Foundation are doing with their emerging leaders programs around the world, that again is really tapping into leaders and saying, how are we thinking about and becoming more conscious of who we look to and think it's their role to help address issues in society? Those pieces are really at the heart of helping people think differently about what they can do, and feel more empowered to, oh, I don't have to suddenly become a completely different person or set up a nonprofit to be able to contribute in the world. What are the levers I already have that I could use differently to be more impactful?
So let's talk about leadership first, because I think you and I both care a lot about leadership, and we want it to improve in some places. I think there's always opportunities for improvement. What do you think are maybe the top 2 or 3 things that you see with the companies you're working with governments? What are the top 2 or 3 things that you see are gaps that leaders have today?
One of the bits, I'll come at it from a slightly different angle at first, because one of the pieces I'm quite passionate about that I think is a massive gap is that we don't actually support leaders themselves. So there is expectations and all of this pressure that's always put on leaders, and yet very rarely are we saying, how are you going? What do you need? Is this actually fulfilling or meaningful for you? And when I talk about those 2 areas of passion for me, of the leadership part and the business part, I do think of them as equally important, because if we keep leaving that gap where we expect so much of leaders and they need to be always on and always solving everyone else's problems, then that only works to a certain point. And I don't know about you, but I have seen many times over that you can maintain that and then suddenly you're exhausted and overwhelmed,
Yeah.
and people are like, okay, I can't do this anymore. So the first gap I would actually bring up is not so much saying it's a gap in the skill set or ability of the leader, but it's a gap in their support and ability to figure out and understand themselves better, and where they need to find some of that help. So that piece is actually really important. And not only is it that society doesn't tend to provide that for us as leaders, it can be quite awkward for someone who's spent their whole life, even when they were younger, always the natural born leader and all of these things that were said to them, and the kind of role or identity they took on. It can be difficult for people to then admit, actually, I know that it looks like it's all together, but I'm not feeling great and I do need help. So that piece would be the first
Yeah.
big gap I would kind of talk about, and it's layered. If we then move into some of the practical elements that are more in that capability development and supporting leaders around aspects that would help unlock some of these ideas we're talking about, I would say that those unconscious pieces I spoke about before would be where I always start. So saying, there are things that are driving how you make decisions, how you prioritize, how you're spending money in the business, which you may not even be conscious of. And they've been taken on board over the decades of your life experience. And we need to just stop and examine some of those. And so you can make intentional decisions around, do I actually believe that business is just about profit maximization? Because often people will say, no, I don't think that. It's definitely can be both. But then you look at their decisions and they'll say, when I'm talking about different ways they could move forward. And then they'll say, well, I am running a business, Bessie. And I'll think, oh, that's interesting. What does that
Mhm.
mean?
Yeah.
So the unconscious piece would be that next big gap that I would bring up. And the third one that is very common and present, whether you're working with an emerging leader in the Obama's program, a leader of a really established business, or in government, would be that when we start to think about those elements and we're working on ourselves as leaders, often what people then aren't doing is taking that next step and saying, if I've really benefited from that strengths-based approach of figuring out where do I bring the most value, how do I show up in my own brilliance and not get caught up in doing other people's jobs or pulling down into the weeds, often we're not making that next step and saying, how do I now create that platform for my team and tap into their brilliance and make sure they have access to those same pieces? So I think there's then the third gap would be that making sure it flows down into how we lead and manage others, that we're then creating that support that has been created for us. They would probably be the three main patterns, I would say.
Totally agree with all of that. So, yeah, I mean, it's very prevalent, and it depends, of course, what's happening in organizations, and all
Yeah.
organizations seem to be going through some sort of change or transformation, or something is happening, organizational changes just
Mm-hmm.
internally. So it's a never-ending change cycle for many. We used to say change is a constant. So
Oh, yeah.
I think that's very true. So one of the things that you talk about is kind of moving from a mindset perspective, from moving from an either or to a both and,
Mm.
which I love. I would love for you to share a little bit more about how you yourself got to that place of seeing those, and how you help other leaders start to look at that for themselves.
So one of the bits that I find tricky, and you and I also have in common the same wonderful writing coach, AJ Harper.
Mhm.
And one of the things I found very difficult work when I was working with her that is tricky for me in answering that question is that I feel like I've always had a both and mindset. So when you kind of say, so when did that start or where did that come from? I'm like, oh, I think I must have just always been odd.
That's totally
Um,
cool. You can have that
and
forever.
it's a tricky one to pull apart. Where did that come from? I do think there are elements. When I'm working with leaders, I often say, what's the thing you find easiest to do? Because you should probably charge the most for that, because
Mm.
that's your natural that's where you have an edge that someone else finds that very difficult to
Mhm.
do. But you're like, it's your blink capacity of like, oh, yeah, that's obvious. I would say this idea of both and is probably my blink piece of it. It comes naturally to me. When I was much younger, I often have referred to myself as a walking contradiction. There's that piece of I'm comfortable with sitting with the fact that like things that someone else might think are contradictory, I'm like, of course they're both true. Like it doesn't have to be pick one.
Mhm.
And so I grew up in a family that was very much focused on social justice and to whom much is given, much is expected. And the idea of having a perspective of not comparing yourself to those around you, but looking at a global sort of sense and saying if you have running water and electricity, you are in the wealthiest of people in the world. Consider yourself lucky. Um,
Mhm.
and then that was combined with some of the other ideas around core values of work ethic and independence. And so I've had a job since I was 10, very focused on hard work and all of these types of ideas. So I felt comfortable with and tuned into the fact that there was skills I had that I loved working hard, and that connected to that was some of these leadership ideas. But I was very lucky in my mid-teens. My parents had amazing friends, and one of their friends uh, was a leader in the first ethical investment company in Australia. And I remember listening to him when I was probably 16, and he was talking about some of these ideas of really intentionally choosing where you invested your money or where you spent money as a consumer, and thinking about that uh, influence and power that you had. And I was in a family that didn't have much money, and so it hadn't kind of clicked in my head that, oh, everybody has options to do that. And he spoke about the fact that even if you were only on an average wage over the course of your life, more than $2 million would pass through your hands. And so what were you going to do with that? And I was like, $2 million. Oh my goodness. Like, wow, that's amazing. And so it started to kind of put these ideas together of, you could choose the bank that you put your savings with, or you could choose who you buy products from, that they are thinking about the environment or their supply chain or how they treat people. So those ideas were kind of in me from a young age. And then it really, when it came into work and my career, it was about saying, I didn't feel like a natural fit in one or the other. I studied politics, international relations. My master's was in counterterrorism. But I had that social justice aspect, but I didn't feel like a natural fit to go into the nonprofit world. I loved business. I thought government had a role. So I was always looking for that middle ground of, where do these things overlap and how can I take the best of all of them, because I think they all bring something of value, but I don't see myself as a natural fit with just one of those elements.
I mean, I think that's true just by looking at your bio and all of your education. you have a
Random.
well-rounded world. No, but there's all connections, right?
They are connected.
The one for me, though, that always surprises me when you talk about is the counterterrorism.
Yeah, people find that strange.
Yeah,
I don't know why.
so what was the thought process behind that one?
Well, so I think that, again, if you think about it from a leadership perspective, the curiosity of what is it that draws or creates a movement? What is it about a leader that can get people to get behind an idea or follow that idea, positive or negative? What is it that we're looking for as humans that then drives us in really intense ways to make decisions? So it was all of these aspects around the role of the leader. What does power look like? What are humans longing for that draws them to then either really destructive or really positive outcomes? Those pieces actually have massive connections and tie into all of the work I do, because again, it comes back to that thing of, just like there's the either or mindset or the both and mindset, if you look at something that's considered as an extreme, like fundamentalism, it's the othering of people and saying that, there's us and them. Those ideas are either or. That's saying, the moment I do that, I dehumanize you and I say, if you win, I lose. If what you believe is true, then you're saying that what I believe is wrong, right? So we're going to these either or positions. And that has always fascinated me, of like, oh, but why could there not be beautiful elements in what you think and beautiful elements in what I think, and they don't have to cancel each other out? So that's a way that I would look at why that is fascinating and why it connects into what I do. And then I would also say that from that leadership perspective, one of the beautiful things in studying from an academic perspective, but also then when I did my master's thesis and went into, a country that I had been fascinated by and loved some of the different leaders there. And I was able to write my thesis looking at charismatic leadership. So I was looking at 3 different types of leaders and how they engaged and where they were at their best. And that was fascinating to do at a young age, and then be able to learn some lessons from other people instead of learning them myself, and kind of go, oh, that's what happens when you are in your brilliance, but then you don't know when you should get out of the way. Well, that's what happens, so all of those elements that might seem either extreme or different to the work I do now, they are deeply connected to that choice of, do you have a both and mindset or do you have an either or mindset? And they deeply informed my ideas around leadership.
You know what I love about all of that is that even though you came at things early on, right? You were given information, you were going to places maybe earlier in your career than others might. You took all that in and really just held on to it and used it to continue to refine the way you think and understand people and from a leadership perspective. And I think sometimes younger leaders think, oh, well, I'm not experienced enough yet, right? I haven't been through enough yet to know that, or no one wants to listen to me because I don't have, 18 years of experience.
Yeah.
So I'm curious from your perspective, what advice would you give
Mm.
younger leaders who are in those moments of, "Ugh, I'm just not there yet."
It's an interesting one. I've always talked about one of the bits that is frustrating when you're younger is that, particularly if you're quite ambitious, which I may have been, um, is that there's a part of you that is so frustrated because you just want to find someone who will hire you or take you on based on your potential, not your experience. Because
Mhm.
there's that element of you can bring so much more than your current CV or resume would suggest. Because as you said, you don't yet have here's my decades of experience. And the way I used to look at it was I would talk about, yes, there is some incredible elements that we should value around experience and whether someone has experience. That is true. But there's also real value in exposure. And I always say I had from a very young age exposure to incredible thinkers, amazing leaders, really influential in shaping how I saw the role of leadership and what I saw as possible in the world. And then because I always was proactively putting myself in positions where I was being exposed to other people's experience and I was taking that on board, it actually massively sped up my ability to step into spaces and already be able to spot patterns and anticipate what would happen because I was so curious in the way that I had watched and learnt by osmosis from other people. And so I think for younger people, seeing that and saying there's value in shadowing people that you think do incredible work, even if you're not getting paid for it, or even if it's shadowing them through reading their books or listening to their podcast, like learn from other people, be exposed to ideas and experiences that you may not yet have been able to physically be in there or in the role yourself. But as you pointed out, don't leave that as an intellectual exercise. It has to then come into your own practice. So it has to be the connecting of the dots, which goes back to, I would say right back at the beginning of our conversation around that element of my story and my work. One of the pieces I don't see other people doing that I think changes the outcomes I can get for a leader is because people aren't bridging those worlds of money and meaning, because they're either able to really tell you how to set up a foundation or contribute in the world, or they can tell you how to grow and scale your business. The same goes for young leaders. If you have these elements, but you're not connecting the dots, then it doesn't bring as much value. And so I think put yourself in positions where you are exposed to hopefully more of the good side, but watching other people make bad decisions is helpful too.
Yeah.
And then use that not only for your own learning and your practice, but make sure you talk about those things differently. So if you're in an interview or you're with someone who you'd like to work with eventually, talk about what you have learnt from those situations or how you have proactively put yourself in a position where you were able to spend 2 weeks working with someone alongside and what you loved about watching them in action. So don't downplay the value of exposure.
Hmm. Love all of that. So I hope everyone is listening and taking notes on that because, and I think that applies no matter, how long you've been in leadership or how
Yeah.
long you've been leading teams or organizations, it applies.
Mm.
Okay, I want to transition into values because Bessie and I spent some time working on, I guess it would have been what, eight people in the group that were
Yeah, it was a
looking at
nice small
their
little group. Yep.
organizations and what they do and their values and the values of the leader themselves. So I would love to have you talk about your perspective on a leader's values and then
Mm.
how that applies to an organization's values.
Yeah, so when someone, depending on the size of your organization and your role in it, will depend which elements of this conversation you kind of focus in on. But if you are the founder of the organization, or you're still in kind of the early stages where there's not a big leadership team or other owners in the business, then when we have a conversation around something like values, it's important to understand just how connected and how much our fingerprint is all over our business as leaders. And so when I do values work with people, I tend to, if they are the owner or the founder, to make sure we also look at their own origin story, what their core values are, even what their core values were growing up, because all of those things give us little data points that will show us, now I can see and understand why you're making the decisions or prioritizing in the way that you are. So you're right, there is an element of an individual leader's values and wanting to understand those, but then also looking at the organization itself. And obviously it's a really long and detailed conversation. We could talk about values for hours.
Yes.
But if I was to pick out a few elements, most people have probably been in situations where you've had deeply unsatisfying conversations about values, where they're very shallow or, just unsatisfying, because you think, okay, yes, I can get behind the fact that we should all be honest and have integrity, and these quite generic or lofty ideas are what we tend to hear when people talk about values. The piece that I think makes it really powerful and helps it to actually be something we can put into action is to have some more robust conversations that push that a little bit. And the way that I find that helpful is to use, for I think since about 2010, we've always used Patrick Lencioni's work. So he wrote a great book in, I think, 2012, which was called The Advantage. And he went into some of these elements in more detail in that. But he pulled apart different types of values. And I think that this is a helpful one, because most of us feel a bit awkward letting go of some of those generic ideas. Like if you said, no, you can't list honesty as a core value, people would be like, but that means I'm a liar. Like, oh, no, it doesn't. So he has these different elements. So one of them is around looking at the permission to play values. And so that's where you would put things like honesty, integrity. They're pieces where you definitely want to say they have to be present, but it's just the starting point. That's kind of being a decent human being. So as an organization, we say, yes, we aren't going to hire someone if they're dishonest. It does need to be present. But when we then step up into some of the other categories, we are able to have a healthier and more honest conversation. So when we then have one of his other categories is called aspirational values. And that category is really important for us to have as leaders in businesses, because often we see something that isn't actually present yet in our business, but we know that it needs to be. So Lencioni talks about aspirational values as being something that needs to be present for you to be successful or achieve your goals in the future, but it's not yet there. And what's helpful about having that category is that when you name it in that way and you say, oh, we've realized that to achieve our goals, we're going to need to really start to look at problems from different angles, take more risks, and not be so risk averse or traditional in the way that we come at things. And so when naming this as an aspirational value, your team and your customers and people will go, great, that's exciting, because now you can lay out how you're going to get there. Yeah. If those things aren't present and you already name them as a core value, people have this disconnect because they're like, you're actually not at all innovative and you're very risk averse. So it feels strange that you're calling that a core value. Right? So as we kind of step up these layers, naming and having a broader understanding of where things fit and how they sit within the way that we behave and make decisions is really important. And so then when you get to something as critical as core values, you're able to really use things like some of the elements we've already talked about of your origin story. How did the business begin? What was going on? What drove you? and get into some of those elements of a core value being something that has been present and is deeply part of how you behave already. It's not something you hope to have. It's already there. And there's some really lovely kind of little ways that you can get at that. So stories you can tell. One of my favorites is that if something's a core value, you should be able to very quickly tell me at least, 3 or 4 stories of where you had a tendency to take that too far. Because if something's really natural for us, if you think of our strengths or our weaknesses, we tend to kind of go too far with something. And so in that group that you mentioned and working with you, I did lots of those elements of pushing you and others around, okay, tell me a story of that. Where is that present? Bring that to life. How does that look in the way you act? What would that look like to describe as a behavior? So those elements, I'm hoping that just in kind of hearing that, your mind is kind of going, oh, yeah, I can see how having those different categories, how being more descriptive about what it looks like in action would make a values conversation so much more useful than just putting a poster on the wall.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was so brilliant. I never really thought about the origin story piece and
Yeah.
how that connects in with your values. And, most companies have a set of values, right? But they don't talk about them in terms of our core values, our aspirational values, our play values, right? They don't
Yeah.
think about those or at least they don't talk about it. Maybe they do at the higher levels and just don't mention it to anybody else. But, for the rest of the organization, they probably all see the values that an organization places out in public as core values because there's
Yes.
no other discussion around it.
Mm-hmm. And then you can be judging too. There's a few organizations I've worked with where I've actually pointed out that in their attempt to state what their core values were to build trust, they actually undermined trust because people could not see those things reflected in their behavior. And so it was like, you would have been better off not even stating that those were your core values, because now it's had the opposite effect. And so I think it's, again, one of those examples for us as leaders to realize, if we do an exercise in more of that token way of like, tick the box, yes, we have our core values, you will probably undermine yourself rather than actually get the benefit of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was so brilliant. The other thing that we did, which I absolutely loved, and I wrote somewhere recently. Oh, I know. I was just writing something this morning, and I was talking about the work you and I did actually, and saying how impactful it was to put together a mission, a
Yeah.
vision, and really spend some time on that. And I know
Mm.
most people probably would do that at the beginning, but I don't think I knew enough to be able to do that at the beginning.
Yep.
But it really brought such clarity to me around what I talk about now and
Mm.
how I think about you call them markers, I was calling them pillars,
Yeah.
the things that I really focus on: education, coaching, and transformation. And I think for me, it's just made the conversation so much easier for me to
Yes.
have with people. And I assume that would be true for anybody you're doing work with. It's like you have this ability to take the super complex things in the world around your business and make them simpler and simpler till it's very easy to talk about the story.
Yeah.
So I love that you're doing that. And I'm sure it's helping so many companies out there and business owners who don't know how to do that.
Yeah, I hope so. And I mean, those two pieces you just spoke about in terms of mission and vision, I think they often fall into the same category as values, where
Mm-hmm.
people, when I see people's current descriptions of their mission or vision, they're very generic. It's what you think you should say or
Mm-hmm.
what you've heard someone else say, and that sounded like they were very clever, or they were. So we're kind of taking on board these things and just saying, well, that's what a good mission statement looks like, or that's what a vision piece is. The way you've just described it is the piece I'm passionate about, which is helping people realize the more you actually pause and come to an articulation that's deeply meaningful for you as a leader and that makes sense for your business, then it achieves those pieces you just described of suddenly when we're in this world, and you were saying before that businesses are like, change is constant and it's
Mm-hmm.
rapid and it feels like it's just speeding up more and more, right? When you're in that, where you are bombarded with all of these different decisions to make and change constantly being present in the way you're having to lead and adapt, if you don't have really meaningful, customized filters or those pillars that you talked about for your business, it is so difficult to make discerning decisions, to be able to kind of look at and prioritize and filter through all of that noise. The more that you have these pieces that I would say are foundational elements in place, the more you're able to go, of those 150 decisions that just got thrown at me, actually 85 of them don't even need my time to consider because they are not relevant to what we're
Mm-hmm.
doing. So the problem is, without any of these filters in place, we treat everything as being of equal importance, and we have to make the 150 decisions instead of going, no, a whole bunch of them fall outside the parameters of what is even relevant. We're not considering those.
Yeah.
So the filters and these really meaningful answers to what does it look like for your organization, they aren't just a nice fluffy thing to do. That's one of the frustrating pieces over the years, where people are like, oh yeah, this is great, we've just got to sort out our strategy and things are a bit crazy at the moment, but we'll get to it at some point. And my point is, oh gosh, actually, if you did that first, all of that craziness and the
Yeah.
strategy would fall out of this. This is your strategy.
Right. Right. 100%. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about your Jasper blueprint that you helped build for me, which I
Yeah.
love so much. So I want you all to picture like this beautiful one-page document that has your vision, your mission, your values, those pillars that I talk about. Bessie calls them markers, and I think it just allows you to look at it and make the best decisions about your business. But I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that and how you're using that in your future book, how you're
Yeah.
using that in your business with people. And I know your podcast is kind of moving more towards that
Mm.
direction as well.
Yeah. So it really has been, the last 2 years for me has been around trying to take all of the amazing work I've had the opportunity to do over 24, nearly 25 years now, and say, the reality is that of the 333 million small and medium-sized businesses around the world, not that many of them have the time or resources to be able to engage consultants at the extent that would be necessary to build out these foundational elements in their business. Because to do each piece one-on-one with a consultant, you'd end up spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? And that's not an
Mm-hmm.
option for most businesses. And so what I've been doing over the last 2 years in particular is saying, how do I take responsibility for boiling that methodology down to its essence and kind of saying, what are the questions people would need to ask? What would need to be present? And how do I get that to a place where I can remove some of those barriers around access, both in terms of price point and the way it's delivered? And Sue, the honest answer is, and you mentioned you were part of the group where I was doing a bunch of testing last year, that it's an ongoing experiment. I've said this year I want to get the first 100 businesses through with their Jasper blueprint to keep refining that. And it hasn't fully landed yet because it's difficult to go from when you're working with someone one-on-one and you've got the time and resources to do that, is a very different piece of work to trying to get a group of people, or through something like a book, to a really useful end product, if you like, of them having
Mm-hmm.
that type of decision-making tool. But I think I'm getting closer. So the pieces that are, if we talked about what is a Jasper blueprint and how do you actually come to have your own Jasper blueprint in your business, I think of it as a customized decision-making tool. So it is that piece of, instead of being overwhelmed and, like I said before, having no ability to filter all of the different pieces being thrown at you, how do you work through step by step some really specific areas like your origin story, your core values, your mission, your vision, understanding your business model and what that role is of like, oh, where are the opportunities or levers I could pull here in my everyday decisions in how I run the business that could connect in to what I care about. So it's doing the thinking and working through without having to just figure it out on your own, to work through some specific steps and questions to answer these and get to an articulation of those fundamental aspects. And then using that, and as you said, you've got your top, that one pager, which is kind of the touchstone. So if we say the Jasper blueprint, Jasper was used to test the purity of gold, right? So it was a touchstone, that's why I used that word Jasper in there. That one pager is your touchstone to come back to and not have to read through 80 pages or your whole business plan, but kind of glance at it and go, whew, feeling overwhelmed, lots of decisions to make today. But if I can keep my mind focused on what is most important, how we behave, what we're trying to contribute to in the world, what our unique role is, that kind of centers your thinking. And then behind that, in the development of your Jasper blueprint, you then have the deeper thinking and explorations that you've done. And now in the program that we're rolling out, which is a 6-month group program, we have very specific, what I call decision-making tools. So there's specific pieces where you can then use those to run through any decision that you have that comes up in the business, but now with not just generic ideas, but your particular articulation of, okay, does that fit within our mission? Is that aligned with our vision and our values? Like those pieces, what we're trying to create with the Jasper blueprint is saying, you don't have to figure out on your own. This is built on decades of experience and methodology. So it's giving you that step-by-step process, but it's not giving you an off-the-shelf answer. So you and I, Sue, we could have the same opportunity in front of us. If I used my Jasper blueprint and you used yours, I might decide it's a really great aligned decision and you might decide that would be a distraction for you. So we want to get to a place where we're making it easier for businesses to have these pieces in place without having to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on consultants, but where they land with their own very personalized, customized filters to make decisions that are meaningful for them, not just this kind of one-size-fits-all approach of this is what a good business looks like.
Right,
so that's
right,
really
exactly.
important.
I love that. Yeah. So having been through even a smaller version of what she's putting together, and I know just knowing Bessie as I do, the amount of refinement that happens in between each session is
Slightly
incredible.
excessive.
in a good way. That's not in a bad way, in a good way.
Yeah.
So if you are a business owner and you're interested, I will put the links for all of her information. When is your program kicking off? Soon.
So we've got a free masterclass at the end of May. So that, in terms of US dates, 27th to the 30th of May is the free masterclass where we're going to be talking through the elements of what's important, really helping people see what their business could be doing and whether this is a good fit. And then we will kick off the next round of the 6-month program we'll do onboarding that following week, the 3rd of June, going up till the end of December for that next group.
Okay. Well, I highly recommend it. I've already written her a testimonial. So, if anybody has any questions from my perspective, happy to share, but I will put all the links for everything in the show notes, and take her free masterclass. You will learn a lot just by being a part of that, for sure. So I've done that too. Okay. So I want to transition us into the 4 questions that I ask everybody on the show. So the first one, what is visibility and why do you feel like that's true?
So for me, I would say that visibility is around opportunity, because it's this idea of if people don't even have access to or know what our ideas are or how we think we can change the world, then what's the point of that idea? So without the visibility, we don't have the opportunity to share that. So, but that would be my word, would be opportunity.
Love it. And what are you yourself doing to be visible?
So at the kind of practical levels, it's things like I started my podcast 2 years ago, going on other people's podcasts, just being more present and sharing ideas on platforms that are important to me. So my primary one would be LinkedIn, but then also sprinkling in aspects on Facebook and Instagram where other people are hanging out. But those pieces, and then connected with, for me, the relationships are really important. So finding other business leaders who I really love what they're doing, and then speaking at their events or coming into their communities or supporting their clients. So it's about finding the right communities and then sharing the ideas that I have with those people.
That's great. What is the best leadership or career advice you've ever received?
Probably the element for me of being reminded that no one knows what they're doing because, um, stopping and feeling like you talked about this with younger leaders before, of kind of going, I need another 15 years experience, or I'm not there yet, or assuming that other people have it all figured out. Brad, my partner of 21 years, when I was much younger, was very good at constantly saying to me, you don't have to be in very many rooms to quickly realize most of those people aren't very impressive. And I
Yeah.
found that to be true. So just
Yeah.
you're like, okay, relax, it's all good.
Yeah, exactly. It's so freeing, right? If you can put that in your head,
Yeah.
makes a lot of difference. You show up differently.
Yeah.
What is a book that you would recommend to the audience?
So there's lots of books, but to control myself and just stick to one, I would say The Great Work of Your Life by Stephen Cope, which in the last 6 months I've probably reread about 8 times. I love it. I've given it to many people. It's a great, great book, and I think brings a lot of these ideas together and helps people. One of the things you and I have talked about, Sue, is that often we feel like the work that we're doing or our business isn't impressive enough or a big enough calling. We're not eradicating poverty, so it can't be our purpose in life.
Yeah.
This is a great book to kind of honor what your unique brilliance is, what is your calling. And then I think for most business leaders, if they read that, a whole lot of light bulbs would come on.
Mm. Well, then it sounds perfect for this discussion for sure. I love everything that you shared. I am so glad that we finally made this happen. I'm excited for you to get your thoughts and ideas into the world in a bigger way. She really is brilliant. I'm sure that you could see that and hear that just in what she has shared. I will share all the links with everyone. Where's the best place for people to reach out to you, though?
So just going to my website, so bessigraham.com. Again, we can share that. If you go there, you'll be able to then find the masterclass, the podcast, all of the elements will be there. And
Okay.
for social media, LinkedIn would be my preference.
Okay, awesome. All right, well, I will share all that. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being here. I loved our conversation so much.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, Sue.
Of course. All right, thanks everybody for joining today on the Visibility Factor podcast, and we'll catch you on the next one.